So we appreciate all that. So ended up, you're the perfect person to have on in the aftermath of what happened with Bishop Strickland, and to help us to understand, and like the title says too, what can we do, as we are facing, these times, and this very sad moment of Bishop Strickland being removed from Tyler. So Father, if you wouldn't mind, what's some of your initial thoughts, as we're just days away now from Bishop Strickland being removed. I mean, where did your thoughts go initially, and where are you right now with all this?
I have a very complex view of this whole situation, not necessarily complex in the sense I think there's different layers to it. I think that very often people are getting hung up very much on just the particular event and the injustice that's perceived and things of that sort that's actually going on, when I think there's all sorts of facets to this thing. When I first heard it, I thought, well, I knew it was coming. I just didn't think it would be as soon as it was. I figured it would be after the first of the year before we would see them actually move in that regard. And because there was a bit of a time lag, I thought, well, maybe they're just going to sit on it. But so I look at it from the point of view of, for me, there's 4 different levels to this thing. The first is the reaction that people are giving to this thing, I think, is we have to be detached from the situation, because if we're not detached, what's going to happen is we're going to react emotionally and not with clarity. I think Doug's opening statement is right on target. It's a matter of we have to make a rational and a measured response to this. And that response, I think, is several-fold. One is emotionally, we can't let this stuff get to the better of us. Part of that is, and I don't mean to get too long-winded, but I think part of it is, if we have an emotional response, certain people in the Vatican, I'm not necessarily saying the Holy Father, but certain people in the Vatican will use that as the opportunity to say, see, we told you this is what the real problem is. Whereas if we have a very if our approach to this is very holy and very measured, then I think that will actually go much more in our favor, and it won't give them ammunition. So I think that the emotional side just has to be very calm. The second part of it is this is a time for valor. I agree that we have to fight for the truth and what's happening. We have to fight for the church, but as they say, discretion is the better part of valor. We really have to be prudent in how we're going to proceed in this thing. And I don't think it can just be natural prudence. I think it has to be supernatural prudence, which has God primarily as its object. Because in this whole thing, I think that Bishop Strickland's removal is a symptom of a bigger problem that the church has. And so I think that prudentially we need to take a more spiritual approach to this thing. I mean, I realize that prudentially a lot of people, we were talking a little bit about this before we actually began the segment, but it's one of those things where people are just like, well, we need to protest and we need to sign petitions and this and that. And I would probably generally agree that I don't know if those are going to be very beneficial. I think I think that's just going to cause people to react even more when this is all said and done. That is the people in authority. So there's, I think, prudentially, what we need to do is take a serious look at this. Okay, in a spiritual prudential way, how are we going to approach this? And for me, there's 2 parts to it. The first is there's a positive, and then the second one is the negative. The positive sign is we have got to start praying and become holier, because if we don't, this is going to continue to happen, and we're going to lose not just Bishop Strickland, we're going to start losing other good, solid bishops in the process. Because if the Vatican feels, it's kind of like, when Pilate saw that, that it actually, or that, that the Roman authorities saw that it actually emboldened the Jews, or that they got a good response from the Jews, they started going after the other ones. Well, that's the same thing that's going to happen here. After the other apostles, it's the same thing that's going to happen here in relationship with the bishops. So the main thing is we have to grow in holiness. And I think that's something that we can discuss off and on throughout the course of this, because as many of you heard me say, I think the fundamental reason he was removed is a symptom of the bigger cause, which is we get the leaders we deserve, and we're not getting the ones that we would like. I mean, Bishop Strickland is one of those that everybody loved. We wanted him to be around, and we were not as holy as we should have been. And as a result, God took him from us. It's very similar to Jesse Romero just tweeted out that he thought that it was very similar to Joseph, right? Joseph was taken away. They sold him off into slavery, but in the end, he is the one that ends up becoming the one that saves many people. But anyway, the point being is that I think that we have to start working on holiness. I think that's something we can talk about. The other side of it too is this is a sign of a spiritual, the negative side, which is as people are not becoming holy, and is because we are becoming weaker and weaker on a spiritual level, the demons are encroaching more and more, and they're emboldening the people that they influence. And so we're going to see these kinds of things happening with greater frequency, with greater rapidity, precisely because we're not doing our part to keep them spiritually at bay. So my basic attitude is the most effective response we can have to this is going to be a spiritual response, specifically to keep the demons at bay, block them from being able to do this more in the future, but at the same time praying. And, I not that I'm that much of a big fan, although I do like many of the priests in the SSPX. I've known a number of them. I think a lot of them are very holy men, or they're trying to seek holiness and what have you. But I think the fact that the SSPX would have these like million rosary, but they would try and do 1,000,000 rosaries for the sake of a particular thing, and they would do it, and it would actually happen. I think that was God's sign of telling us we need to have that approach in relationship to, on the positive side, we need to do prayers, sufferings, and good works to achieve these things. And I think it needs to be concerted effort. So those are just some of my initial thoughts.
Concerted, I think of my big word these days is unite.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. Yeah, jump in on this. We're going to get to your book as well. Let's do the book first, because I want to address that, let people hear about that a little bit. Okay. But then I want to get back to what you said about, what we get what we deserve. Because we were talking about this before we started recording, and I see this even in the governments. We've got a World War III potentially on the horizon, and we hope and pray that it doesn't evolve to that. But everything just looks so rough now. Russia, Ukraine, Middle East now. As we speak, more stories are coming out of, military bases, U.S. bases that are being hit. U.S. is retaliating against, the proxy members of Iran. I mean, this whole thing is just such a tinderbox. Yeah. But these are the prophecies of the Blessed Mother, church-approved ones, that, God allows war because of man's sin. That was Fatima, Our Lady said in Fatima, and many other places where she has talked about if man does not repent, there will be chaos. And even in Akita in 1973, she speaks about the demon being especially implacable or relentless against consecrated souls, like you two gentlemen, and how many we've seen struggle so much in these areas. So, but before we break all of that down, a little teaser for the audience, stay with us. We want to get into all of that. Father, your book and the timing of when this book came out and what it has to do with, tell us a little bit about that. And I mean, amazing news. You sold out the first printing already, right?
Within 48 hours. Yeah.
That's incredible.
Wow.
Yeah. So the first printing, well, I should say there's a bit of backstory. So originally, somebody might have seen it on some of the podcasts. I had just mentioned I had written a book called The Limits of Papal Authority Over the Liturgy, and it's only available. I didn't put it available on Amazon. It's only available through our press, Centrad Press.
Yeah, you still sold out. When
we still sold out. Oh yeah, literally less than 48 hours. Once we made it public and I talked about it, it sold out in less than 40. And so we have the way it's working now is that we just did a rush order. We should get those books in about a week. So if you can still order it, when it comes up, it'll say back ordered, but you can still order it, and then it's based on who orders it when they'll receive it. So the part of the other difficulty we had was, as soon as our because we have several distributors, we have one in Australia, one in Canada, we have several in the United States. Once they found out about it, they put in massive orders, and so we're kind of a bit behind the pile. I did not expect it to sell quite that much. I think a lot of it had to do with the timing, but originally the book was written. It's a somewhat academic book, but it's still accessible, I think, to your average lay reader. And the idea behind it was, I had been hearing Cardinal Burke and Bishop Schneider, Athanasius Schneider, were saying things like the Pope doesn't have the authority to suppress the old Mass, or he doesn't have the authority to do certain things. in relationship to the liturgy. Now, instinctively, as part of the sensus fidelium, I agreed with them, but in all the studies that I had done, it was very scant about what those limits actually were. And I didn't like the fact that it was being talked about, but without concrete principles that give an indicator of exactly where his authority is and where it's not. So the first part of the book is just to establish he actually does have authority over the liturgy, and he does have the right to make certain determinations. But later in the book, as I start parsing these out, so the first part of the book shows that he doesn't have the right to put something in the liturgy that's against the divine positive law or the natural law. There's also one of the things I spend a lot of time on the book is what's called the principle of apostolicity. Christ told the apostles, and Christ himself initiated certain things that were to be in the liturgy. So if the entire tradition of the church, and this is what I show in the book, the entire tradition of the church is very clear. If Christ said, do this in commemoration of me, but then also if he commanded the apostles to put something into the liturgy. So for example, one of them is that he ordered the apostles to put in a preface into the liturgy. This gives an indicator that actually by the time it comes out from the apostles, it's not what the modernists have been telling us for the last 100 and 150 years, that the liturgy in the beginning was very amorphous and there wasn't a whole lot. No, it was actually fairly baked. I mean, there was still a lot of development that occurred, but it was fairly baked as it comes out from the apostles. But if it came from the apostles, the entire tradition church said that not even the Pope had authority over that element to change it. And so this begins to start to unpack. So, and then there's the principle of longevity, which means that the longer something is in the liturgy, the more we know that's the will of God that it be there. Mm-hmm. I talk about how we know the time frame for that. Pius V gives us an indicator of it. I then talk, can the Pope actually suppress a right? And then, so by the time I get to the point where we talk about suppressing of a right, in the book, I'm actually talking about the fact that if you parse it out, there are certain elements of the liturgy over which the Pope does not have authority. And the Council of Trent makes this very clear, for example, when it says he can't change the substance of the sacraments. So he can't change the words of consecration, for example. But there's certain things he has no authority to change. And in that, his right over those elements do not fall upon determination. He does not have the right of determination in relationship to that. He only has rights of preservation. It's his obligation to preserve those elements. Then there are certain elements which we know that he doesn't have right of they come from virtue of the fact that they've been in the tradition for so long that even the Pope. So, like for example, Pius XI, when asked if he could, they said it was suggested to him that he insert St. Joseph into the canon. His response was very telling, and this is something that you see throughout there's bits and pieces of this throughout the course of the book where I talk about this historically, that by the time you get past Trent, there is a recognition that the Pope is very limited in relationship to liturgical change. He can make certain determinant changes, like in the accidental things, those rights. So the third category is rights of determination, but there's a second category where he still didn't have right of determination, although historically they were determined by popes. But once they became set, then because of their longevity, it was clear that this was the will of God. And as a result of that, the Pope, so Pius XI, when asked if he would insert St. Joseph into the canon, his response was, I can't do that. I'm only the Pope, right? So there was a recognition that, and by the way, I'm not against him being in the canon, and that's just a whole nother discussion on itself. My basic point is that, so the Pope's relationship to, there are certain things where there's elements where he has no right of determination. He only has rights of preservation. There's some where he has the rights of preservation, but that there can be minor changes. So like, for example, he could add a word here or there, say to the offertory or something like that, which you actually saw historically. Certain things would actually be added here and there. Or another example is in the elevation. Historically, it wasn't until the medieval period that they had the major elevation where you actually lifted the species after the consecration. So that was an addition. But then, so they talk about the accidentalia. They can change the accidentals. So this is where like changing or adding feast days, making minor changes to certain kinds of prayers and things like that were permitted. And then even those, there were a set of principles that governed even how that was actually done. So by the time you get to the last chapter, the 9th chapter, I talk, can the Pope suppress a right? I talk about there's only been 2 popes that have ever suppressed a right, and that's Gregory the Great and Pius V. And they both suppressed certain rights. Gregory the Seventh did it because a right contained heresy; it contained error. Pius V did it because there were rights that did not live up to they did not fulfill the principle or equality of apostolicity. And even though it was a 200-year mark, there's a specific reason why he does that historically, but that's the cutoff, because it's at that point that you start seeing things get into the liturgy that did not fulfill those requirements. So the point is, I lay out the principles behind what the actual limits of the papal authority are, based not on speculation, but on what the popes have said, what the councils have said, what the saints have said, what the fathers of the church have said, how this stuff has been handled in the past. I also address the question about quo primum and the principles that undergird quo primum, because that's where the real issue is. Because quo primum, if you read it in Latin, is actually a juridic document, not a doctrinal document, but underneath it are doctrinal principles like the principle of longevity and the principle of apostolicity. Those are the things that he uses to demonstrate this is why any priest can say this mass. So anyway, the point was, I just wanted to be able to initially, and then I won't try and hog the camera here, but I initially just wanted to get the principles behind when Burke would say the Pope doesn't have that authority. I agreed with him, but I didn't feel comfortable saying that publicly without actually knowing the principles that undergird it, and I could back it up based on principles. And so the book doesn't go into a lot of conclusions. I'm not there to attack the new mass. I'm not there to go after certain elements. I'm just there to show these are the principles that govern the liturgical change throughout the history of the church, and this is why the Pope is limited in these areas, but then has authority and make changes in these. And so that's kind of the behind the book. But the idea was to indicate that the Pope can't just do whatever he pleases, as Pope Benedict himself said, right? He can't just do whatever he wants. He's bound by certain things, and Pope Benedict would have understood most of the stuff that's in this book, I think. It's just he never really talked about it, or he did in other ways. So that's kind of the idea behind the book. I think it's somewhat timely, because I think that that basically Traditionis Custodes was to the liturgy what Bishop Strickland is to the episcopate, right? And I think that we're just kind of seeing it's two things. It's but the what's behind them, I think, is basically the same. So
yeah,
I'm listening to you, Father, and I'm just thinking, the poor laity, I think they're punch drunk, because what went through my mind is the motu proprio from Pope Benedict of July 7th, 2007, which I always thought was pretty cool, 777.
Yeah.
But I wonder if he did that on purpose. I don't know. But anyway, that basically freed up the practice of the traditional Latin Mass. And then just a few years later, it seems there's this suppression of it, and it just and we want to respect papal authority, but which is it? Is like a personal taste thing almost. You start getting into that.
That's exactly why I went into. Well, that's exactly why I went into the principles of the thing, because I think all of the lay people that I've had read this that were non-academics, every one of them said, this is the first time it's made sense. And so now if I hear something, I know whether it's justifiable or not. And I think that Pope Benedict in that motu proprio was just reflecting what he understood to be the tradition of the church in this matter, or how it was always understood. And I think we're seeing a situation where that it's not necessarily the case, it's only understood. So when I first wrote this book, it was actually to circulate it among academics and certain clergy to get their feedback and to see what their general principles. I got virtually no feedback, because they're just like, well, it's pretty straightforward. I don't know how you're going to argue with the thing. and they didn't really have too much to add as far as the principles. Although I consider this book kind of a seminal book in the sense of it's there to spark the discussion about that, so that when this happened to Bishop Strickland, I was already on the cusp of releasing it anyway. I had been discussing it internally among my community. I was pretty much, it was just a matter of when. And then the timing was fortuitous, I suppose, in one sense, but I didn't really intend it fully that way. It just says, well, I'm releasing it anyway, and I might as well just do it now, because I think this will help people to realize that the Pope is limited in what he can and cannot do. And it helps, I think, calm people down a little bit, so that they, when they see stuff happening, they can kind of back up and say, okay, I can have a rational response to this. I see what they can and cannot do.
And a couple of things. One, why is this an important book for the laity, especially, and for anybody really, to read? I know you've talked a lot about how, with things really unraveling the way it is and the way they are in the church, the need for us to be better educated.
Yeah, well, that's it. I think that's what it is. I think that we're entering into a time when, we've heard the talk from the Vatican, how there's talk about actually suppressing this right, or making it eventually that you can't do it, or restricting it even further. And so even when you understand the principles behind this book, you realize when they can and cannot restrict certain things. And the principle, I deal with it only in relationship to the Mass. I don't deal with it in relationship to the Rituale Romanum, the ritual where the sacraments are. I don't deal with it in context of the Pontificale or the Pontifical Masses, although I think the principles apply there as well. I think it's just a little bit more, and it's far more involved historically to show where certain elements in the various sacraments came from, and same with the Pontificale. But I think the main reason that I'm putting this out is so that people will be educated, so that when these things happen, they can be at peace in knowing what they're doing, instead of just having kind of a visceral reaction or an emotional reaction, which I think we're seeing among a lot of the Catholics in relationship to, for example, the removal of Bishop Strickland. But also you kind of saw that same kind of a thing when Traditionis Custodes there was just kind of this blow up and visceral reaction. And you still see people having that visceral reaction. And I don't think that that's helpful on any level, frankly.
Can you give a quick synopsis of what that is for the audience who might not have heard what we're talking about?
Yeah, so basically what it came down to is that the Pope basically restricted its use under certain circumstances, and that he basically said that the new Mass was I should say, when it came out and it said that the new rite of Mass is the unique expression of the Roman Rite, I actually laughed before I had a chance to read the Italian. So I'm fluent in Italian, and I finally got a chance to read the Italian and found out it was the word unica, which actually means the only, not the unique. Because when I heard unique, I started laughing. I said, well, it's actually true. It's the only rite it's the only rite that exists in the church today that cannot trace itself back to an apostle. So I'm like, well, that's true. But when it comes to but it's the only expression of the Roman Rite. And I said, well, that's just not true either, because of the fact that they continued to allow the old Mass. So it was a matter of restricting the use of the old Mass and sacraments. Although I don't think that I do agree with the canonists that it didn't restrict the sacramental use as much as that Cardinal Roche wanted to say. And there's been some public discussion of that, so I'll let people and Cardinal Roche hammer that thing out. But I think it just basically, it was a restriction of the old rite. And then so that's part of the reason too behind the book is, can the Pope actually restrict its use? That was part of the other question. And I've had some discussions with this with cardinals and bishops at fairly high levels, and the general consensus is that he doesn't really have that authority. But that was one of the reasons why I thought I got to get the book written, so the faithful will have the principles to understand when the Pope can and cannot make the changes, and when he can and cannot suppress a rite, basically.
Yeah. I said earlier that the faithful are feeling punch drunk.
Yeah.
It's what's gonna happen next. And
I
don't. Here's a pattern. Whether I'm right or wrong, there's a pattern that I've noticed. So let's just start at 1973, and of course that was Roe v. Wade. During that time, of course, it was the apparition of Our Lady of Akita that year too. Also, the American Psychological Association released that homosexuality is no longer considered a disorder.
Right.
All in that year. So there was this 1973, and then I just noticed there was a 20-year period. And why do I call it 20-year? Because there was a moment when this dominant influencer for the Catholic Church, EWTN, went full on orthodoxy almost in a moment. And that was when the classic rant of Mother Angelica. And she just went, I've had it. And she just let the liberal bishops have it, because for 20 years, at least, that's kind of, if we look at history, it was post-Vatican II, but they really got their goodie list going right in the early 70s there, right around 1973. And vocations crashed, convents emptied out, and and I don't know, it just, people took a lukewarm approach to their faith, and we kind of lived through all that, 73 to 93. And you know what I thought of too when I think of this too is that quote that I just love, and I brought it up here so I could say, hard times create strong men, strong men create good times create weak men create hard times. So this 20-year period, now stick with me just for a second. So then you hit 73 to 93. Well, the other thing that happened though is John Paul II came in, and this is my take on it. He didn't do a lot in pushing the orthodoxy of our faith, the deposit of our faith. You know what he did instead? He built an army around him. And it was really in 93 that he got a big army at that moment. He got his army behind him. And if you guys, I don't know if you're old enough to remember, but I do. I was ordained 5 years a priest in 1993. And prior to that, I was like I don't know, I wasn't like a flaming liberal or anything like that, but I was casual. But something happened, and we were glued to EWTN in the 90s. I mean, we were fascinated with it, and we couldn't get enough of it. That was just kind of going on. And then that's when Pope John Paul II started getting a little more brassy, a little more Stricklandy, if you will. But he started being, because I think prior to that, he felt like that other part of the church had control, and he had to build an army first. Then he could start taking back what happened. And that was 1993. Now let's go 20 years later. And then what happened after John Paul II is we had Pope Benedict and then Cardinal Burke, and we had the motu proprio in 2007. I mean, just we're creating good times. And then 20 years later, Pope Benedict resigns, 2013. And I don't know. I don't know why 20 years, but it just seems like we go through this, and we're hitting some pretty hard times. Mm-hmm. We're at least confused. At the least, we're confused. I think a lot of people are upset right now, but we're getting a lot thrown at us by what appears to be the side of the 1973 to 93 contingent has reclaimed surrendered ground, it seems. And we have to sit down and shut up, or we're going to get canceled, like fill in the blank, if we dare try to stand up. I don't know. So I'm babbling here. I don't know if you find that interesting or not, but I did. Father, can you comment on that?
Yeah, actually, I think the phrase punch drunk is actually kind of interesting, because I think it's true. I think what's happened is that it's kind of, like you said, it's kind of gone back and forth. And then over the last few years, it just seems like we've been taking hit after hit after hit. Yeah. So when you're punch drunk, you have to go back to the corner and get the smelling salts out, right? I mean, that's how you get your clarity back, is by getting the smelling salts out. Well, there's two smelling salts. The first is the Orthodox Catholic faith, which means you have to study it and you have to know it, and you have to know. This is why I keep telling everybody, if you don't know the limits of papal authority and you don't understand how the church understands this, because you see two people, there's two ends of the spectrum. There's those who say, well, the Pope can do whatever he wants, and that's just not what the church, that's not Catholic thinking. That's not what the Vatican I said. That's not what the church actually says. Even the popes historically never thought that. Then you got the people on the other side who basically are, it's basically saying he can't do this and he can't do that and he can't do this, when he legitimately can do some of those things. So the real issue is the smelling salt is you're going to get your clarity by having clarity about the church's teaching, precisely what those are in this moment and the principles behind it. The second smelling salt is holiness. Yeah. We have got to clear our head. And by that, I mean, we've got to stop being worldly. We have to stop being sucked into every little thing that happens in relationship to what's going on in the Vatican. And this is something I mentioned in the other podcast, which is, historically, the average layman in the medieval period probably didn't even know the Pope's name. And if he did know the Pope's name because it was said in the canon, he probably didn't know much about what the guy did, unless he did something that was significant and the priests were talking about it. But the fact that today the guy sneezes and we actually know, how much barometric pressure he released in the process and all of this is just not healthy spiritually. The smelling salt is, that's why I said you have to go back to the corner and get your smelling salts out. That means we have to unplug from paying so much attention to this stuff and start getting our spiritual lives in order, get our appetites under control, get virtue built, get the discipline in our spiritual life, and get these things in order. And then from there, we can step back into the boxing ring. Yeah. So that being said, I think that's one of the reasons why people just have to really start working on holiness. And I like the word you said, united. I think we have to unite in that holiness, in doing the things we need to do so that we can merit, good and holy bishops, or that at least that we can retain the ones that we have.
Your holiness and uniting is exactly, that'd be the best way to describe what happened post Mother Angelica's rant. I mean, they donned the new habits. They started talking about the Blessed Mother more. They had more Eucharistic adoration. They had more reverence in the liturgy. And people were like, wait, what? Wait, this is awesome. I just knew a lot of Catholics back then that were just like, everybody's talking about EWTN and Mother Angelica and this. We need that. We need, and that's what they were pushing, is holiness, and let's be united as Catholicism, at least in America, but I think beyond. So anyways, you're exactly right, Father. Holiness and uniting right now.
Yeah, and I just think that, as we've mentioned before, we get the leaders we deserve. Well, we also, when there is a good leader, he's going to be taken from us if we don't continue meriting him being over us. And this is, I mean, I have no idea. I have a lot of compassion for the people in the Diocese of Tyler, Texas, because I'm sure there's a lot of upheaval and there's a lot of difficulty and suffering that these people are going through. But in a certain sense too, is that Strickland had become kind of the representation of that unity, because he was a unifying principle. He's not the unifying principle, but he was a unifying principle. And I think that now that that's been taken from us, it's a sign that, okay, then we've got to get our act together so that we can merit good leaders again.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, that was a key thing I wanted to get back to, and you just addressed it, is the fact that we do get what we deserve. God does see what we're doing and listens to our complaining, our ranting, or our prayers. And so I'm glad you addressed that, Father. Then let's get to the real heart of this. Then is, what should the lay faithful do? There's all kinds of conversation. In fact, as we're here, I'm looking at a news article on my other monitor here, written from Religious News Service, saying that an American bishop gets a deserved hee-ho from there's all these attacks still going on, and everybody's an expert, by the way. Could you address this point before we get into what the lay faithful should do? We are wasting so much time, I think, just around like, and I know this and I know this, and there's a lot of, I don't know if it's like judgmentalism of, I understand what's really going on here, and I'll be the first one to say I don't have any clue what's going on some of those levels. I have a hard time figuring out what God's telling me to do. I mean, can you address that whole world expert, and we debate ad nauseum now as if we are experts?
Well, yeah, I mean, the first historically time that we actually saw it, Doug, was actually with the Protestants, right? Because the Protestants said the Holy Spirit will enlighten you directly. Well, that just moved the standard for objective truth regarding religion from external objective teaching, which the magisterium would teach us, to the internal thing. Well, that was the principal foundation of modernism. So what that's a sign of is that modernism has become completely entrenched in even the best people's thinking. By that, I mean in the sense of the people who are trying to lead a good Catholic life but they barge in areas that they know nothing about. It's for example, when you hear people talk about whether a pope can lose his office because of heresy or not, this is an area of theology that is extraordinarily difficult and requires an enormous amount of knowledge and background. Even the greatest of theologians were very careful to make sure that they were extraordinarily precise in this area, because you can just end up in error very quickly, right? Well, it's the same thing that you're kind of seeing here. It's the term that kind of comes to mind is ultra-crepidarian. I don't know if you've ever heard that term.
I'm going to try to spell that.
Yeah, it's ultra-crepidarian.
Okay.
The definition of an ultra-crepidarian.
I'm putting it on a t-shirt.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
So the definition of an ultra-crepidarian is someone who barges into a discussion and makes his position known when he knows absolutely nothing about the topic.
Oh, that's
And
me.
that's what we're that's what we're seeing all across the board, because modernism has transposed the criteria for whether something's true or not from objective reality. People don't judge whether they know something or not based upon objective reality, but how they feel or how they relate to the thing. And this is what I think. This is what we're doing. So this is part of the smelling salts thing, right? I mean, people have got to start learning more. But I think the other thing is, and this is something which, as Doug, as you were talking, it kind of occurred to me. I think the other part of this is that people don't seem to grasp that. What St. Paul says, look, your battle is not with flesh and blood, but with principalities and powers. This is a spiritual battle, first and foremost. The removal of Bishop Strickland is the result of the fact that we aren't fighting the spiritual warfare sufficiently well. And I'm not saying that because I'm an exorcist. I'm saying that's the reality of it. We're in the middle of a horrific spiritual battle. And what's happening is everybody is, or it's, the iceberg, the Titanic has hit the iceberg and everyone's rearranging the chairs. I mean, or people are just squawking about whether, we're in the middle of a spiritual battle and they're worrying about whether I should use 5.56 or 7.62. I mean, it's just, just like, what is, right. Just get the gun and start shooting is what you want to tell people. But that all being said, I think that the real issue is it's a matter of we're not addressing this as a spiritual battle. And in the spiritual battle, the first thing you have to do is make sure that you are a disciplined enough soldier to engage in the battle that you're just about to go into. And people aren't there, I don't think.
So, Father, with this boggles my mind. And so maybe you can help us understand, because you just call it a spiritual battle, and so it is. And one of the ways you can tell it's a spiritual battle is what's happening in the church, what we've been talking about, is happening in the culture.
Oh, yeah.
And for lack of a better way to phrase it, but it's called a woke ideology, is emboldened right now. And in tyrannical form is coming in and saying, you will do this, or we will persecute, we will punish you, we will cancel you. You got to do this. But it's happening in the church and the culture at the same time. What's going on?
That's right. Well, I've mentioned this in other, I think I might even have mentioned this in a prior podcast, but I always tell everybody, they used to have this phrase back in the day, back in the tradition, which as the church goes, so goes the world. So, for example, the removal of Bishop Strickland, that was God's way of telling us that this particular problem of removing that evil people removing their enemies, or that people who are woke, who are on the side of liberal policies or those things that are contrary to church teaching, they are the one, and so they will remove the man who stands as the exemplar to that. We see that exact same thing happening in the public sphere, where we see people being removed from office or taken out or what have you, or sued or whatever the case is, precisely to punish them for having done the right thing. Well, it's happening in the civil sphere because it's been happening in the church for decades. And this is, so we're not meriting the grace in order for this to, we're committing the sins. That means the grace isn't getting into the world by means of the Catholic Church, because as the church goes, so goes the world. This is just the precursor. And I think what's happening with Bishop Strickland is really a sign to us from God, and not to get too charismatic about this, but I think it's a sign from God telling people, you got to get your act together. This is the state of the church. This was showing to us, this is why it's bad in the civil affairs. This is why it's bad in the world. And this is why this is an indicator of what's really going on in the church. And we have got to get our act together, or it's going to get even worse, I think.
So then based on that, and really the title of this particular episode is what what should we faithful do in a response here when you've got people saying, no, don't protest. Yes, protest. Let's do petitions. No, not petitions. yes, let's just pray. Well, prayer, fasting, there, what can we or should we do? I've always told people, look, God's going to inspire different hearts in different ways, but everything's rooted in that spiritual piece first. But
Right.
what do you think after that, then, Father Ripperger, is good for people to hear? How should we respond?
Well, I think the principal thing is, as you just mentioned, it's a spiritual thing. Get your spiritual act together, get to confession, start growing in holiness, do the things that you need to do, start waging the spiritual battle in your own foxhole, right? And start, don't be worrying about what's happening over in Tyler, Texas so much, although we should be praying for that. But worry about what's going on in your own family. Get your families in order, get your families become holy, because a strong, holy family is a force to reckon with. I mean, it has a tremendous impact on the spiritual battle. But I think if people, they have to start rebuilding their families. So they need to become holy. Then after that, I like Father Heilman's idea. I think that there needs to be a concerted, united effort, a prayer campaign of some sort to start petitioning God, begging God for good, solid bishops and for the protection of the good, solid bishops that are still there. And so, because like I said, my concern is if they see, it's just the behavior is the same you see with demons. Once they realize that you've responded in a weak, temerarious way to what thing they just boldly did, even though they know they're actually in the position of weakness, even though you're not. Once they realize that, then they're gonna push it even more. They're gonna push their advantage even more, and I think that you're going to see them start to come after this. So that being said, I would like to see some type of concerted effort, a prayer effort, to where we start praying. It doesn't necessarily have to be anything majorly formal, but lay people need to start praying every single day for the protection of their bishops, the spiritual protection, and the natural protection for their bishops. And also, if they start doing that, the bishops will start being more courageous too. I mean, part of the thing is we look at all this and we're like, well, there's nobody that's carrying the banner, right? And to advance this thing against the woke ideology, against this particular thing. And if you do have somebody, of course, they attack them vehemently. But I think more bishops would come up to speed if they started receiving the grace from the people's prayer, suffering, and works in a unified push to ask God, give us the leaders we need, not the ones we deserve.
Do you have an opinion about
this is why you're the perfect person to have on with this topic? The gospel today is increase our faith, they said to Jesus. If you had the faith of a mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. A mustard seed. Father, if anybody believes in the supernatural, it's Father Chad Ripperger, okay?
Because I deal with it all the time.
Right, you deal with it all the time. But see, we're in this middle of this prayer campaign right now, 40 days to peace through strength. But the petition is that there would be a supernatural revival in the church. Because we're in a Eucharistic revival. What about the supernatural? Do we have the faith of even a tiny mustard seed? Because if we had just that, we could say this to this mulberry tree, be uprooted, it would obey. Father, you're the perfect person to have on right now. We need a supernatural revival, and you're calling us to prayer, but prayer that actually believes that there is such a thing as a God of miracles, and that when we pray, something happens. Father?
I think you're absolutely right. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that it has to do with faith, right? I think that as priests, we can honestly say that one of the things that concerns us is the complete collapse or loss of faith among the faithful. And
that
this is something,
faith, the mustard seed faith that believes in miracles. Go ahead, Father.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. That we're just not seeing that. And that's what people need to do. Now, that means people need to make acts of faith. But, one of the biggest, and I think this is probably part of the lesson in relationship to what's happened with Bishop Strickland, and people say, well, why would God allow this? Or where is God in all this? But I think that it's the same thing that you see with people who are possessed. One of the things that every single person who's possessed, who goes through a liberation process, has to build, the one virtue. There's obviously faith and hope and charity, but the one specific virtue is confidence in God, that God will do the right thing. He will do what's best for you. Even if he's not liberating you right now, he will do the best thing for you. We need to have confidence in God that if we do our part in fighting the battle and doing our part, that he will always do what's right by us. We just have to have that confidence that, okay, this happened to, one of our favorite pastors in the church, a great leader, but the fact of the matter, and quite frankly, I think he's going to be freed up to actually go around lecturing and probably doing even more. But that being the case, I think we have to have the confidence that even in this, God will provide for us if we do our part.
Yeah, I think the point you made earlier, you said that Jesse Romero had tweeted about Joseph in the Old Testament there, and I think that's a great thing to remember. He gets thrown into a well, he gets sold into slavery, he gets accused of some sort of sexual harassment charge, gets thrown into prison, and he's called out by one of the most godless pagan men at the time, Pharaoh, and he is the one who interprets Pharaoh's dream. I always thought to myself, the people in Egypt must have thought, okay, Pharaoh's lost his mind.
Horrible. Yeah, exactly.
He had a dream, and then he's got this prisoner who tells him what it means. And now we got to start storing up food, grain, all kinds of stuff, a little bit of prepping there, people, for 7 years. The whole thing would just seem crazy. And yet God used that whole tumultuous moment of Joseph to bring about this particular amazing role where he becomes second in command basically in all of Egypt. It's a phenomenal story of God taking something weird and challenging and turning it into something incredible. So Father, quick, your opinion on like petitions and marches and so forth. I mean, I love the idea of prayerful, holy, like rosary marches and such, but what are your thoughts on that visible kind of tangible piece that people feel they want to get involved in?
Yeah, I think I think it's a good idea to have some type of visible, tangible piece. I don't know about the petitions or marches or things like that. I'm not. If you look at the woke people, it tends to provoke them more than it does change them.
Right.
And that's my concern about it. I'm not. By the way, I'm not trying to tell somebody they shouldn't do that or that that a group of people shouldn't march. But I'm just saying that But I do think there should be some visible piece to this somehow, that the lay faithful need to make it known that they're, that as part of the sensus fidelium or the sensus fidei, that they see this as problematic and unjust, etc. That, can be a good thing to do. But how that is done, I'm not real sure. When you're beating demons up all day long, you're really not too thinking about whether I should sign my name to a petition or not. So, because I just don't know how those things work. But that being said, I think that there should be some type of visible piece to this, but that visible piece has to be completely backed up by the spiritual component. Otherwise, it will fail and just make it worse.
Yeah, great.
Father, what's a concrete suggestion you'd give to the faithful that are listening right now that they could go to have that mustard seed faith? And I say mustard seed because it only needs to be that much in order for miracles to start happening in people's lives. How do they move from, because I think a lot of us get conditioned to treat our faith life, and Doug, you talk about it a lot, the punch in, punch out Catholic, you dip your hand in, you do the duty, right? And the way I put it, it's kind of like we treat it like a good luck charm. I better do that so the good things happen, kind of thing. You can see the tone of my voice. It's a lukewarm tone. You know what I mean? Yeah. What do you recommend listeners can do to break through into that mustard seed faith that they can start uprooting mulberry trees with the kind of trust and confidence they have in God?
Well, I think that, I'm just thinking in terms of purely the mechanics of it. St. Thomas Aquinas says that when it comes to infused virtues, like the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, but also the supernatural infused virtues of supernatural prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, he says we are not their cause, so we can't increase them on our own. What we do is, he says, we perform the action to that, and then that causes a disposition in us for an increase in that virtue, and then concomitantly God will infuse it. So basically what that means is that people have to start making acts of faith, hope, and charity, making acts of confidence. just on a daily basis. I mean, on a habitual basis. I think that one of the biggest, I think as I get older, and maybe this is just the fact that I'm getting grayer and looking forward to retirement, which I'll never probably get to retire, but the more I look at it, the more I realize that the key virtue in all this, because as St. Thomas says, that charity is the form of all the other virtues, is that people just do not love God either at all or enough.
Yes.
And I think that we just have to start telling him at regular intervals, I love you, I love you, I want to be with you. And then he will infuse an increase in that love in us. And we need to just start doing that. Tell him, I love you and I want to do your holy will. Because if they truly love him, they won't just punch in and punch out. They're going to want to do these things. It'll give them the zeal. So in fact, St. Thomas says that zeal is the effect of charity. So that's my recommendation, is just start building the virtues and start telling God you love him, which is charity, but then start making acts of faith and confidence.
Yeah. And, that's funny, because a priest friend of mine years ago, he's passed away now, had said to me, when you struggle with loving God, just say to God, I know I need to, I should, and I want to. Give me the grace to love you. That's just right. to put it all back on him. Let him just open the heart and just say, I know this is the best thing. Even if I don't fully comprehend or understand where my heart is with this, but Lord, give me the grace to want to love you even more. And Father, I just think that, what you're talking about really, and both of you fathers are saying, is that this boils down to, we can look at all the external pieces of this and the visible things that we see in the news and with the debates and the arguments and the movements that are coming out of, shuffling positions around and this and that. And it all boils down to what, and I like that you said this, Father Ripperger, in our foxhole, what we're doing right then and there is the most important piece of our role in this world at the time. My duty, my family, what I'm doing right here and now. Does that sum it up pretty much?
Yeah, I think so. I think absolutely. That's where the foundation is built. Doing all these other things isn't going to do anything if you don't have that built first.
Yeah. That just seems to be such a key piece to help people understand. Because I know, and I would say this, and I had said this, I put a little video out earlier today on my own YouTube channel, and I basically use this example. I said, we shouldn't be too shocked that this even happened, considering what we've been seeing over so many years now. But I will say this, if you ever live on a farm, and I wasn't on a farm per se, but I lived out in the country up in Nebraska, and I'm down here, and Tyler is my diocese now. But even down here in my backyard, if I'm going through a wood pile, just like up in Nebraska, if I'm going through a wood pile or something in the garage, in the shed, I expect to see, I don't know, a mouse or a snake or something there. Therefore, when I see it, I'm not stunned and shocked and paralyzed and basically freaked out. And I think when we wake up in the morning tomorrow, if something else has happened, or there's been another shuffling of positions, and all of a sudden a Father Chad Ripperger or Father Heilman has been canceled for some reason, if something like that happens and people just, oh, I can't believe this. Why can you not believe this? This is the world we're living in, where things are ramping up like this. Does that make sense, Father Ripperger, that we have an attitude so that we don't become paralyzed and stunned? Let's just expect that things will probably continue to move this direction. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, in my former when I was in the fraternity of St. Peter, which I still have fond memories of being in there, and I love the fraternity of St. Peter. But when I was, and I didn't leave them because I didn't like them. I left because I thought this was a God's will for me. But when I was in the fraternity of St. Peter, my nickname was the Prophet. And the reason I was called the Prophet is because I would just look at it and I'm like, okay, there's a train on that side of the track. And on the other side of the track, same track, there's another train coming the same direction. These are going to hit, right? At some point. Right. And people would get mad at me because then the trains would hit each other. And I'm like, I wasn't the guy who caused it. I was just noticing this is what's coming down the pike. Right.
Yeah.
I think the mistake that because people are so absorbed into their own emotional lives and that type of thing, and because they're not very sober, if you look at the state of things and you look at the way that our leaders, both in and outside the church, are talking, what just happened, if it didn't happen, we should be surprised, frankly.
Right.
We should have and we should expect even more. Because if there's not some type of, and I'm thinking more in terms of a spiritual blowback, let alone a natural blowback. But if there's not a spiritual blowback to what just happened with Bishop Strickland, it's just going to embolden the demons even more, and it's going to continue to snowball.
And when you say spiritual blowback, you mean that we respond spiritually with deeper prayer, fasting.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes, exactly. That our response is, well, then I'm going to become holier, and I'm going to crush them in my life. Because it's like any other war. If you're in your foxhole, you take out a whole segment of their line, and the next guy next to you does. Eventually, you start. It's not just that one front, even if they're on other fronts, becomes so weakened that it starts to affect even the other fronts to some degree. When this is what's happened in the spiritual life, if we do our battle. So in other words, if we come up to speed spiritually on this thing, then the demons are going to be a little more circumspect on how they inspire these people to do their inspire the behaviors that they do.
Right. That's good.
Father, thank you so much for your ministry, for your priesthood, for your belief in the supernatural power of God. You're an inspiration for all of us to do the same, to not be that punch out Catholic, but to love God so desperately and to believe that he loves us and that he is the God of miracles. Father, thank you so much. Could you, with that kind of amazing belief in the supernatural power of God, could you end us with a prayer and your blessing?
I'm just trying to think of which prayer we should probably say, but yeah, let's just do this. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Lord Jesus Christ, I believe each and every teaching that you have solemnly revealed. I believe in them as an act of faith. We believe in them. We have hope in what you have promised and for the forthcoming age when we are all in heaven. I also love you and God the Father and the Holy Spirit, that we make this act of faith, hope, and charity. We have perfect confidence in you, Jesus Christ, to deliver us from any evils that would beset the church, or to protect us and our families in relationship to those evils that are in the church and in the world. And we also ask you, Jesus, to provide for us all the grace, send the Blessed Mother and Saint Michael to protect us, and especially the mediators of all grace to provide us those graces necessary so that each one of us may respond in the proper way to this whole thing that has happened in relationship to Bishop Strickland. And then a blessing. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sanctus super vos, et manet semper. Amen.
Father, thank you so much.
Thanks, Father.